I'd like to thank HeartMit. I wasn't on the speaker list until last night at about 10 p.m. So I've just put together a very short, brief introduction to what we're doing and some of the philosophy behind the approach that we've taken. I'd also like to thank him for that introduction this morning. I think it was, in some ways, very moving. I think that it's, especially coming from the condensed matter theory side, you see quantum mechanics everywhere, and in the world at large, and especially in biology, people ignore it, and I've never understood why. I mean, even this segregation between the seemingly trivial and the things that are a higher level expressions of quantum mechanics, I don't understand that division myself. Because if you ask the question, what about this thing could be the same if it was classical, the answer is nothing. Because electrons and matter, as we know, it doesn't exist. It's not quantum mechanical. There's some essence at the very bottom of all of this that requires quantum mechanics. And I have never understood why people draw dividing lines between behavior at the electronic scale and behavior at the macro scale. Because, sure, there may be dividing lines. And there may be areas where a system may be modeled classically, but you can't pretend that the thing is classical. It's not. Nothing is classical. Under the hood, everything is quantum mechanical. And so you have to be open to the possibility that the things that you care about as a scientist or as a builder of things can be made better, more efficient, or you have to understand how these things work in order to make progress. So this theme is explicit in the exercise of trying to build quantum computers. Because in some ways, quantum computers are this idea made manifest, that you want to somehow amplify the behavior of the world from the electronic scale, or the scale of the very small and very cold, up to a level where large, hot, macroscopic things, such as humans, can play with these things and make them do things that we find interesting, like solve hard problems. So I'm going to talk about one such effort, which is the one that we've been involved in for some time now. So D-Wave is a private company that's been around for about 11 years. And we only do one thing, and that is build superconducting processors. So these are processors that are fabricated out of metals, in particular a metal called niobium, run at very cold temperatures, designed to embody a very specific quantum algorithm, which is this quantum annealing thing that HeartMit referred to earlier on. So these things are not universal quantum computers, for those of you who are familiar with the field. They're not gate model quantum computers, which is a particular type of quantum computer. They're another way of looking at how you would use quantum mechanics in order to compute something useful in the world. It's a fairly small effort as these things go, but we do have some unique infrastructure, including what's commonly believed to be the most advanced superconducting chip fabrication effort in the world, which is run by Eric, who's sitting back there. So if you want to know anything about superconducting chip fab, he's arguably the world-leading expert in all of this. And there was something like the crown jewel in our efforts. Our ability to fabricate these things efficiently and quickly has differentiated this effort from a lot of others. So I'm just going to very briefly talk about where we got to where we are over the last 11 years. And there's really two phases to this effort. And I think that this model of how we did this applies to all sorts of basic science commercialization exercises. So I think it's relevant to this group. So if you have something that is inherently involving a huge basic science concept or concepts, and you want to bring it out into the world, this is a path to doing that has been very effective for us, and I think there are some lessons to be learned for others. So the effort's differentiated in two phases. The first phase was one where there were some conceptual notions about how you'd proceed to build a quantum computer back in 1999. And there were the first vestiges of experimental data that suggested that you could actually build components of these things in the lab that had something like the properties that you wanted. But back then, this was like Imagine the task was to map the entire US. The area that had been mapped was this tiny little 100 square meter area right next to where the ship landed. So there were some things known about a very tiny amount of the types of things that you'd need to build one of these systems. So being young and foolish, me and a bunch of other people in the early days felt that it was a worthwhile endeavor to try to map more of this territory. So we wanted to understand what was known and what was doable, not just in principle, but in practice. It's a very important point I'm going to come back to. About all of the different areas that you need in order to really build a computer. So quantum computers are computers. And the way that I look at them is they're more computer than quantum. And that's not the way that most people in quantum computing view this field. The quantum for them is a capital Q and the computer as a little c. For me, it's the other way around. The most important part about building a computer is building a computer. And this is not just semantics. It flavors the entire philosophy behind this project. So we entered into a bunch of research agreements with universities and research institutes around the world with the intent of trying to answer some of these questions about what was doable in principle or in practice. So that went on for a while until it became clear that the original vague conception of how this would all turn out, which was that someone would try to build a quantum computer for real, and that we would somehow be involved or help this effort along. That was just not going to happen. No one really seriously tried to build one of these machines, and they still haven't. Just being realistic about the amount of effort that's required in order to really build a computing system. I mean, imagine even a conventional silicon processor, like the cell chip. It required billions of dollars of investment. And in some ways, that's just an incremental step over what was already known. It was a so-called engineering project. There's nothing like that in quantum computing. Even the effort that we've put into this, which is in the sort of $100 million range, is nowhere near the effort that even a single new semiconductor chip gets. So the scale of effort that's required to do this is not being invested by anyone for good reasons. But anyway, so what we wanted to do was to try to implement an idea, because we didn't see any value coming from this if somebody didn't do it. So we figured, why wouldn't we? Again, we were young and foolish back then. So what we decided to do was use the knowledge that we'd gained to try to understand, was it actually possible, given the limited resources that we knew that we'd have, to try to build a quantum computer? And the idea was to focus on architectures that were extremely tolerant to the types of faults that you get in the real world. So when you build a semiconductor chip or a superconducting integrated circuit, you have to deal with the real world consequence that not all of your devices are going to be the same, that there are going to be variations across a wafer or across a chip. Not every 2 qubits is going to be identical. You're going to have to deal with the issues that there's going to be defects in all of this. So how is your system going to work in the presence of all of that realistic stuff? So the thing that we've ended up building is not the be-all and end-all of quantum computing. In fact, I think it's in some ways just a very early faltering first step. But this effort and things like this are required to get to this future that everybody in this field dreams will someday happen, which is that we have control over nature at such a fine level that we can start exploiting these things that we can see. You can take a microscope and you can look at things, and you know that quantum mechanics is a very good model of nature at these levels. But how do you actually use that? And so this is the very first early step on the way, and in some ways parallels some of the stuff that we heard this morning about photosynthesis, is that it's just beginning to dawn on the collective conscious that there are things that you can do here for real, practically, within timescales that we care about. And it's very exciting time to be involved in the field. All right, so what I'm going to do is show you what one of these things look like. So the implementation that we use requires cryogenic temperatures, and that's millikelvin. So we use machines that are called pulse tube dilution refrigerators. So these are machines that allow you to cool a very substantial block of stuff down to close to absolute zero, in our case somewhere around 10 millikelvin. The inside of this metal cylinder contains an insert which looks like this, where these circular plates exist at different colder and colder temperatures, from the top being room temperature down to the bottom being near the base temperature of the fridge. And at the bottom of this, you see an assembly, which is a bunch of filters and shielding elements. And the chip itself resides right down at the bottom. Now, for us, there are two very difficult to meet environmental constraints. One is the temperature. The other is that the processor type that we build is very sensitive to magnetic fields, and they can't be anywhere near the chip. So people get amazed at the fact that you can attempt to build a computer that runs at millikelvin, but that's really not the hard part here. It's much harder to make these low magnetic fields than it is to make the low temperatures for a variety of reasons. So we've done a lot of work on magnetic shielding. That thing at the bottom there, if you look a little closer, has something that's very much like a motherboard, upon which is mounted the actual chip itself. And remember, these are superconducting chips, so they're very much like your standard CMOS-based device, except that now we're talking about metals instead of semiconductors. And it exists right at the middle there. So this see if I can bring this thing here, is one of the chips. This is an optical photo of a portion of one of the actual processors. And I'm going to explain a little bit about what all of this is. But just to give you some flavor, these cross hatchings are actually loops of metal. So these things that look like white lines are actually topologically loops. And these lines are the so-called qubits in this type of design. So every time you see one of these horizontal or vertical white lines that look like lines, they're actually loops of metal, and these are qubits in this design. They're so-called superconducting flux qubits. The way that they encode information is in the direction of a current which flows around this loop. So if you imagine counterclockwise rotation of this current around this loop corresponding to binary state 0, and the other direction corresponding to binary state 1. These things at low temperatures are binary objects, so they can only have one of those two states, and those are the states that encode the information that we care about. So at a higher level, the way that the system works is that all of this low temperature physics gadgetry is connected to the world, and you can access it remotely. So all of the stuff that the experimental guys back at the lab can do to the system, you can do from here. If you could resolve the projector issues, I could show you. So we're actually sitting on one of the leaves now, and the way the thing is architected, it can handle multiple users at the same time doing simultaneous experiments. So about the processor, I'm gonna be a little bit philosophical here. So the dominant paradigm in quantum computing is a model that arose from the computer science and mathematics communities, largely. And it is a beautiful model which is universal for quantum computation. But it has one significant flaw. It makes assumptions about the world that are not what you see in nature. So the natural world has a certain way about it. So when you go into your lab, and I have a condensed matter physics background, and I think a lot of my views of this is flavored by this. So condensed matter physicists study real systems in the lab, bulk magnets and things of this sort, where it's simply not natural to think about the thing that you care about in isolation from everything else, because almost nothing in the world is like that. All systems in nature have a thing that you care about, and they have an environment. And the environment significantly impacts the behavior of the central system. So the gate model conceptually relies as a first pass on the absence of that environmental coupling. Now there are methods that have been developed that work in principle that allow you to remove the effects of environments. But I've always been of the opinion that they're not feasible in practice. So I'm gonna be a little bit controversial about this And I don't think that this particular model will ever be built. And that's not the common theme that runs through the quantum information community. This has been a model that people have focused on for a long time now. But I think that this model ignores some basic facts about the way the world works that you cannot, in practice, overcome. Yeah? So I've listed some of them, and any of the experts in the audience who want to debate me about this point. Okay, so back then, I'd convinced myself that this gate model was not a good thing to try to do. And so we were faced with a decision. And being ornery, we decided to do number 2. And the inspiration for what we ended up doing came from the same group that the first speaker referenced. And it's based on ideas arising from the field of quantum magnetism. So quantum magnetism is the study of magnets, usually at low temperatures, where the behavior of the system somehow exhibits quantum effects. And this paper was very influential to me, both as a graduate student and also in my professional life at D-Wave. And it's got a lot of text on it, but I included it all because it's one of my favorite passages from any science paper that I've ever read. And the stuff in the blue is really the summary nugget of what we do. So the idea is that you want to build a quantum magnet. So usually in nature, quantum magnets are given to you. You have a crystal of something that has yttrium and holmium and a bunch of stuff in it. It just is what it is. It's not programmable. You can go in and you can measure things, but it's not all that useful as a computer because it kind of does one computation. It mimics itself. You know, you can't program it. So what we wanted to do was take the exact same paradigm, but make it programmable. We wanted to be able to set all of the different parameters in this thing, but otherwise make it virtually identical to a quantum magnet. So I don't have time to talk about what may be the most interesting part of this, which is how quantum effects are used. What I'm going to do instead is I'm just going to talk about what the thing is supposed to do and not how it does it. So what the system does is it allows you to define an optimization problem. So this thing on the left, this psi, is an optimization objective function, which is defined over binary variables. So these s's are +1, -1 variables, or you can think of them as 0, 1s. This expression means that for any particular setting of those s's, I get a number. The h's and the j's are the program for the machine. So as a user of this machine, I specify what those are, and I set them to be real numbers between -1 and 1, all of them. So the h's and j's are just numbers. They're the program. They come from some application or some idea about how I want to use the system. It's a separate issue. I give them to the system, and now the system's job is to return me a configuration of all of these s's, so settings of switches. And if everything works just so, that setting of switches will be the minimum number that you can get. So there's a setting of these switches that minimizes this objective function. Yeah? So that's what we're looking for, almost. I'm going to clarify that a little bit. Just to kind of attach this to the physics or the physical picture of the hardware. So recall I mentioned that each of these little white guys is a qubit. So the way that this architecture works, this thing is a unit cell. It's a repeating block that tiles the plane. So I'm showing only part of a circuit here, but you can imagine this could stretch out for a long distance over a chip. This, say I pick this qubit. This qubit has physical connections to all of its intersecting guys. So I can couple this variable to this one, and so on. And it also has connections between unit cells via these guys. So these yellow dots that I've shown are areas where you can program this pairwise interaction. So I can, as a user, look at every single intersection and every single join there and put a number on that, which is this quadratic thing. I can also put a number that's local to every variable, that h thing, on each of the guys. So my job as a programmer is to figure out how to do that in order to make something make sense. Now, just a little bit of a segue or a transition here. What you actually get in nature is not the exact right answer every time. And this is related to the fact that these things are real condensed matter systems interacting with a bath at some temperature. So what you actually get, or what you would expect to get as a realist, is a distribution over these answers. So if you go back to Hartmutt's original picture about quantum annealing, any physical system that is defined by this energy landscape, this optimization function landscape, has many, many local minima and a bunch of junk in it. What you're going to expect to get from this is a sampling from all of those energy states. You don't get the exact answer every time. And for some hard problems, you're not going to get it at all. So this is an NP-hard problem. It's likely that quantum computers can't solve NP-hard problems efficiently. It doesn't matter, because that's not the way we're using this. We're using it to generate samples from some probability distribution. In the limit of 0 temperature and everything being great, you get the ground state of this objective function, which is the exact answer, but you don't really care about that happening all the time. All you want are good samples fast. So at a high level, this is actually a very simple thing. It's much simpler than the silicon computer. It's just a lot different. The chip is a generator of probability distributions that you can tune as a user. So those of you who are involved in machine learning or in pricing derivatives or in anything that requires Monte Carlo, where what you're doing is basically trying to draw lots and lots of samples from a predefined probability distribution, that's what this thing does. The way that it works is you first program it by setting these guys. Then you have to wait, because that generates some heat. So you let the chip cool down. Then you do one of these quantum annealing algorithms that I haven't talked about at all. Then you read the thing out. So every qubit is read out at the end. That gives you a bit string, these S's. And then you repeat lots and lots of times. And every time you repeat, you're drawing a sample from that probability distribution that you've defined. So just to give you an idea about how well this works, the thing is amazingly accurate. So the probability distributions that this thing generates are indistinguishable within the errors involved in extracting basic parameters of these circuits like inductances and capacitances from open quantum systems models. So we heard a little bit about non-Markovian density matrix approaches this morning. We have to do the same thing here when we model these systems. So this is an open quantum mechanical system. You make a bunch of predictions. When you measure these, and what you're predicting are these output probability distributions. And what you see track exactly to the experimental data for the biggest systems we can simulate. So that's great. So these things are working quite well now. Just briefly, the focus of the company is on machine learning applications. And again, if you want to know why, you can ask me that. And I'd hoped to be able to show you this, but apparently we've been having some technical difficulties with connecting to the projector. So if you'd like to see an actual machine in action afterwards, come see me and I'll plug it in for you. All right, so that's it. Just to summarize, we have 7 of these things working now. The generation of chips that I can show you after have 128 of these little devices. And they're quite highly integrated as superconducting circuits go. They're among the most highly integrated superconducting circuits that have ever been built. And the next generation is going to be considerably more complex. Thanks.